Good morrow. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining. My name is Kate Burgess, and I'm the Conservation Program Manager with the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators. Glad you're all here. Before we start, I'd just like to give an offering in recognition of the systematic exclusion of Indigenous people in what is currently known as the United States from critical decisions that relate to the conservation and health of land, water, wildlife, and people, and to a great degree still are. So the next hour or so is aimed at addressing that exclusion, but more broadly offering policy opportunities for states to fully recognize their responsibility as treaty partners and to offer steps forward through options such as returning land back, the repatriation of wildlife, offices of strategic partnership, and so on. We have a really fantastic panel today. We're so excited that this is the second annual Tribal Relations 101 for state legislators broadcast. So thanks for coming back if you're still here. And I'm really grateful to every single one of the folks that are tuning in today that are taking the time to learn. So to kick things off right away, I'm going to pass things over to Brittany Schulman, who is the Senior VP of Programs with Native Americans in Philanthropy. Brittany is an enrolled citizen of the Waccamaw Siouan tribe, is a traditional storyteller, organizer, and fortunately for you all, is your moderator for the next hour. So Brittany.
Tanake Harurira, thank you so much, Kate. It's really good to be here with you, share space, and it's really my honor to moderate this panel. We have a wonderfully diverse group who are going to share their experiences. And as I bring you into the space, I would love for you to introduce yourself and then share a little bit about your background. And we're going to start with my friend, Alvin Warren. So if you could come into the space and we will introduce you, let you tell a little bit about your story and your background. Welcome, Alvin.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Alvin Warren. I'm from Santa Clara Pueblo in northern New Mexico. I've served in a variety of capacities as a tribal leader for Santa Clara Pueblo, and then I served for 3 years as the Cabinet Secretary of Indian Affairs for the state of New Mexico, which is one of the reasons I'm really excited to participate in today's discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alvin. We'll now welcome Eustaquio into the space.
Sheikh Pachwai, Inknashwaniksha Eustaquio, Nenotoka Eustaquio, Makwalihihualacan. My name is Eustaquio Beltran, and I serve as Partnership Advisor in the Office of Strategic Partnerships at the Department of Interior. My background is in public policy and in philanthropy, and I'm very happy to be part of this panel.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Eustaquio. And last but not least, one of our Native Youth Grantmakers, Quinn, if you could join us and tell us a little bit about your background.
Chokma, Sohoshafat Quinn, Chikasha Saya, Chatasia. Hi, everybody. My name is Quinn. I'm a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation in Choctaw, born and raised in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Currently, I'm a policy analyst for the Indigenous Leadership Initiative, working to start a national network of Indigenous land guardianship here in the U.S. I'm also a artist and have done a lot of documentary work about Indigenous-led conservation here across the U.S.
Thank you so much, Quinn. So we're going to go into the questions and really talk a little bit more about Tribal Nation Relations 101. How does that look? What does that look like? And how we've seen these things happen. And really would love for you, our audience, if you have questions, feel free to use the chat and share them. And we'll get to as many of those as we absolutely can. But before we get started and into those questions, really wanted to start with, why should states center tribal governance sovereignty in their decision making? And I'll turn that over to our former cabinet secretary.
Thanks, Brittany. I think it begins with a recognition that the United States, through our Constitution, through treaties, through our laws, Supreme Court decisions, have recognized tribal nations as sovereign nations. and has very specific responsibilities and obligations with regard to tribes and to Native people. Also, for about 100 years, the United States entered into treaties, I think some 374 treaties that were ratified between the United States and Native nations that are that should be the law of the land, many of which, perhaps almost all of which, have not been fully enforced or abided by, but nevertheless were entered into between the United States and Native nations. As a result of that, the United States continues to have a nation-to-nation relationship. I know we're here to talk really about state legislators and their roles. And I think it's important to point out that both states and tribes are recognized in the United States Constitution. And that is sort of sets the foundation for what we now call the government-to-government relationship between states and tribes. When I was cabinet secretary, one of the things that we realized when I had just finished completing 2 terms as lieutenant governor for my tribe when I became cabinet secretary, and what I knew in both roles is that the issues, almost every single issue that is important to states and tribes cannot be fully addressed by either alone, whether it's healthcare or transportation, certainly addressing things like climate change, environmental protection, job creation, any of these things where there are tribes involve a necessity to work together and to collaborate. So the final thing, 2 things I would say are the United States supports the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And it is, I think, something that is aspirational, but it really sets us a kind of a new set of goals that each of us, whether we work in tribal government or state government or wherever we sit, that really kind of can ground us in how we should be interacting between state governments and tribal governments and fully recognizing the rights of Indigenous people. And also understanding that we have a proactive or an affirmative responsibility, I would call it, to include Indigenous people and tribes, because there has been a long history of excluding Native people and tribes from decision making, particularly about policies that affect us. And so I would say all those things are reasons for why we should center Native people, especially in terms of state policy making.
Oh, thank you so much. And I think the continual reiteration of tribal governance is always so important. Estaquio, from your perspective, why should states center tribal governance and sovereignty in their decision making?
Thanks, Brittany. That's a great question. And I appreciate and I echo the comments that were shared before. I think also it's important for us to recognize that it is in all of our best interest when tribal nations are doing well, ecosystems around them also do well. The science is in, the data don't lie. Native people are really the best stewards of the land, and we all thrive when those decisions are mostly left in their control. That's why the federal government has prioritized Native partnerships and tribal work. If you look at Executive Order 14112, it really is the tip of the spear that calls upon state and federal governments to really be partners with tribes, specifically funding areas around environmental revitalization and conservation. So as a result of this, the federal government has incentivized partnering with tribes to the greatest degree in our history. Never before has it been this beneficial to partner with tribes in terms of gaining access to federal resources, in terms of really expediting what some of that work can be, and some of the mandatory requirements for setting aside funding from federal and state pots for tribes and tribal communities has never been incentivized the way that it is incentivized today. So it makes business sense, it's strategic, and really you should be working with tribes if you want your priorities to move forward. And I think that's why it's never been a better time to work with our communities and to really engage us.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And Quinn, I'm actually going to ask you a little bit different question coming from a more environmental perspective. What is it that you wish state legislators knew about treaty rights and tribal sovereignty, especially when it comes to environmental decision making?
Yeah, such an important question. I would point state legislators to the fact that indigenous peoples have been stewarding their traditional territory since time immemorial. And it's not just a ownership type relationship. It's it's a philosophy that is rooted in care and what is best for the ecosystem as a whole. And that perspective is has led indigenous peoples to um, create these management regimes, what we would probably term in other scientific language, um, that are much more in line with a holistic view of ecosystem flourishing. And unfortunately, I found on the ground doing documentary work that if people know that indigenous peoples exist in some places, that visibility is still such a huge issue, thinking particularly in the South. Um, but even if people understand that there are indigenous peoples still here, that there are all of these sorts of these regressive ideas and stereotypes that just are not true. But if state governments listen and work and collaborate with tribal nations, I'm confident that these ecosystems can return to being their biodiverse selves.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I also want to ask Mr. Warren, if you would kindly, what do you wish, especially working in state government, what do you wish state legislators knew about treaty rights and tribal sovereignty when it comes to environmental decision making?
I think what was previously shared is great. Just to maybe build on that a little bit. Sometimes folks who don't necessarily know much or haven't had the opportunity to learn much about tribes might think of tribal sovereignty as only something that gets exercised within the current recognized boundaries of a particular tribe, nation, or pueblo, in our case, in New Mexico. When I think Quinn made the point, like, we have to think about it actually differently. We have to think about indigenous peoples as having connection to a much larger area of land. Even for tribes that were removed from their original homeland are still connected, not only to areas around their current land base, but to their former land base. That is not something that is time bound or that has expired. It's something that continues to this day. And so tribal sovereignty includes, as part of its exercise, means for tribal leaders, the protection of places that are beyond, sometimes far beyond, the existing boundaries, and very closely monitoring and engaging in things that are happening outside of those recognized boundaries, as well as what's happening inside, because they have a direct effect. I'll give you an example. From the time that I served as secretary, one of the laws that we were able to change had to do with the way that subdivisions are approved. So subdivision developments are approved. And what was different about that is we built in essentially a consultation process. And these were for subdivisions outside of the recognized boundaries of tribes. And the reason why this was done is, at the time, the Pueblo of Zuni, one of the tribes here in New Mexico, made a very convincing argument that if a subdivision development happens upstream from their reservation, that could directly affect the water, both quantity and quality, coming to that they depend on for their own community. So they should have a voice in those developments because they're going to have an impact on them. Here, my tribe and several tribes are in the shadow of Los Alamos National Laboratory, and that has a direct impact on lands that are not currently recognized as owned or controlled or in trust for our tribes, but they have a direct impact on cultural sites, on resources that we still rely on, the plants and animals and so forth. So I think that's a really important part, that exists, and it should also be recognized by state legislators that many treaties guarantee hunting, fishing, and other rights off reservation that tribes have fought through court cases to protect and to exercise those rights. So I think reframing around that is extremely important.
Thank you so much. And then Eustaquio, same question. What is it that you wish state legislators knew about treaty rights, tribal sovereignty, especially when it comes to environmental decision making, knowing that a lot of decision making policy coming out of the federal government really is centering tribes?
Mm-hmm. Well, I definitely appreciate the words that were spoken before and the importance of celebrating and honoring sovereignty. I also think that if you were to snap out of that way of thinking, it's also just a strategic collaboration. There's never been a better time to partner with tribes. And when you look at the federal funding opportunities that are available, if state legislatures want to partner with the tribal community to help them achieve their goals in an area, think of broadband, right, which requires intensive amount of resources. It's important, and those an issue like broadband cannot be solved by the tribe alone or by the state alone. And so you really need to be working with the federal government to bring in some of those federal dollars that are still available, that have been native, there have been some set asides for tribal communities, which is the area of gap when we're looking at connectivity. And it's an area that connects, to our missing and murdered Indigenous women, because we have found that, if you look at the places where there is a lack of connectivity, the moment that our relatives needed to call for help, they were looking for either a landline or a signal that they could get, messages out to people when they were in need of help. There's a direct correlation between the lack of connectivity and the safety of our Native women and girls. And so when you think of an issue that big, and what it takes to dig and bury fiber into our communities to get us connected, not only just to e-commerce opportunities and other online business development, but for the safety and security and to accomplish one of the federal goals and the state goals. So it's an opportunity to collaborate and to multiply the resources that are initiated at the table, because the federal dollar can come in and really stack up many opportunities throughout the federal agencies that can be a benefit to those communities. Especially when you add on top of that the mandates for, Buy American and for American products. People should know that, nothing is more American than Native Americans. And when you're wanting to, enforce that, it's a really good opportunity for economic development and workforce development across all of our communities. And that's good for the state, the federal government, and our tribes.
Thank you so much. A lot of times our environmental decision making is so inclusive of the economy and our other priorities that having all of those pieces in place are super important. Thank you so much. I want to turn it over to Alvin for a moment, because you were Cabinet Secretary of Indian Affairs for the state of New Mexico. To my knowledge, New Mexico is the only state that has a position like that at that level of governance. But really want to dig into, what did you see the state get right when it came to improving relations with Pueblos and the other tribes in New Mexico?
So, there's a couple of things that I think are foundational that might be useful to folks in other states. And I appreciate, Brittany, you recognizing that. I think New Mexico now may be among 3 states that have somewhat of an equivalent of a cabinet level position. I don't know to what extent those exist as fully formed departments in the way that New Mexico has an Indian Affairs department, but at least having a tribal voice at the cabinet level, I think, exists in 3 other states. Other states have considered it and haven't yet taken that action. So I think that is a place I'd like to start, because, what that took, it was really something that tribal leaders pushed very hard when Bill Richardson, the late Bill Richardson, was running for governor. And they essentially held him to a campaign promise to elevate what was then called the Office of Indian Affairs to become a cabinet level Indian Affairs department with a cabinet secretary. And I happen to be the second person confirmed into that position by the New Mexico Senate. So that's one thing that I think New Mexico got right, is really structurally elevating the concerns of Native people and a mechanism to engage in a government to government fashion with tribes into state government. I think that's crucial. On the legislative side, there's a parallel. And this actually happened before that. And it's been sort of interesting. It's been iterative to get to this point. But we have, the way New Mexico functions, we have alternating 30 and 60-day sessions, which are considered fairly short, I think, compared to what most states do. But during the intervening months, which is largely, April all the way through December, some cases January, there are interim committees that meet. And New Mexico the legislature created an interim Indian Affairs committee that's comprised of members of both houses. It's bipartisan, obviously. And it provides a consistent forum, a monthly forum where that group meets all across the state, usually on tribal land, and they hear the full array of issues that are important to tribes and to Native people. And that then becomes a mechanism for, identifying needs, creating legislation, endorsing legislation that then gets carried into the session. We have 2 standing committees that both have Indian Affairs as a part of their charge. So those kind of structural, I think, interventions are really crucial, number one. Number two, the thing I'll just mention is in New Mexico, we enacted something called the State Tribal Collaboration Act, and that was done in 2009. I want to recognize that we learned from folks in Washington State and in Oregon who hadn't done something exactly like that, but who had done certain things that we thought we could learn from and put into state law. I want to recognize this law is not perfect. I think there are lots of ways to improve it, but at least it set a foundation for things like an annual State Tribal Leaders Summit, for annual reports from state agencies on what are they exactly doing, what partnerships have they entered into, what issues have they addressed that are important to tribes, and very importantly, what funding are they providing to tribes? Because a lot of times we forget that tribes as entities put a lot of money into state government, by virtue of gaming compacts, taxation, other mechanisms. And individual Native people put a lot of money into state government. So seeing how that money comes back to tribal communities is very important. That's part of that report. Tribal liaisons, raising the bar in consultation to actual collaboration, working towards consensus. So that kind of mechanism instituted in state law that really sets then an expectation for how the state agencies interact with tribes. So I think those are a couple of things that the state has gotten right particularly during the time that I was there.
Awesome. And would love any of our state legislators who are listening in and maybe don't have some sort of mechanism in place. We have someone you can reach out to talk about how that can be implemented in your state for your context. I want to go to Quinn, and you've worn many hats, and I'm particularly curious about your work advancing Indigenous land guardianship. There's land conservation policies that are sweeping state conservation portfolios. How can lawmakers write and prioritize policies that strongly support Indigenous guardianship and reflect and align with Indigenous spirituality and culture and values?
Yes. Well, in our work at the Indigenous Leadership Initiative, we make sure that all the work that we do is from a nationhood first perspective. And I believe that is crucial. State legislators and any government official should be listening to Indigenous peoples and allowing them to lead these efforts, not the other way around. Which may sound obvious to many people, but unfortunately, as somebody who has worked on the ground, and especially in places which might not have as much Indigenous visibility, unfortunately, a lot of this work happens in ways that I would consider to be inappropriate. And if you listen to Indigenous peoples, that's how you know that the work is going to be grounded in Indigenous spirituality, because that's what we do. I guess I don't want to speak for everybody, but this idea that spirituality is not something that can be used to inform scientific practice is just a perspective. And actually, we can gain a lot from incorporating our traditional perspectives alongside what has been termed Western science in the way that we engage in conservation work. But I guess that's all to say, it must be Indigenous led. No matter what happens, it must be Indigenous led.
Thank you so much. Eustaquio, just to shift gears a little bit, you're in an interesting position as you're leading the Office of Strategic Partnerships at the Department of Interior. What can you tell state legislators and our audience about the unique relationship between tribes and federal governments, and why is that important for states to keep in mind when developing policy or doing business? I know we've talked a little bit about this, but really want to put that pin in that, if you will.
Yeah, well, I think this was something that was well articulated by Alvin earlier, where he says that it's a structural elevation of government-to-government relations. So one benefit for states when they're partnering with tribes is that a tribe can approach the federal government at a higher level directly through the cabinet secretary, through the Department of Interior and the Bureau of Indian Affairs, BIA. And so we see that those communications are more directly and I think they get to the top faster if you're working through tribes in the federal government. Also, you have a colleague and a partner at the Department of Interior within myself and my colleague Kelly. The Office of Strategic Partnerships is standing by, ready to connect you to local tribes in your area and to form some of these partnerships that can advance mutual agreements forward. And so it's not just the elevated attention that you get, but it's also the different set of resources that have been set aside for tribes and for tribal communities. And so, it's really important for state legislators to realize that and to really benefit from that for the sake of our communities, and to draw down some of those resources that are still out there, and then to look at different ways that you could stack up what's available at the state level with what can then come in from the federal level. And then you blend in a little bit of flexible philanthropic resources. And that can help so many of these major, massive infrastructure projects really take off.
Thank you so much. I want to open.
And if I may just add one more point to that
Please.
Real quick, because I think it speaks to something that was shared earlier, was that, you really save a lot of time and a lot of money when you let these things be native led. Because as a partner-to-partner relationship with the federal government, we're going to be listening more to the tribal leadership as our partner there. And so working through, as a state legislature, working through the tribal leadership is really key and important. And so building those relationships so that there's a sense of trust, and then you guys understand what the best interest of the community is from both perspectives, I think that is what can really help to expedite the relief and then the distribution of federal and state resources for the mutual benefit of the community.
No, that was an excellent point to add, that we can start from the beginning instead of trying to retroactively fix or fit policies if you just start with working with Indigenous communities. Speaking of working with Indigenous communities, this question is for all three of you. I'm going to start with Alvin first, and you all, because you already spoke to some of this, do you have any examples in mind of innovative and effective partnerships or policies between states and tribes that are contributing to Flourish for All? And then what are the elements of those partnerships that allow them to flourish? And I'm not hearing any audio.
Okay, that was me.
All right, there we go.
Thank you. So I'll start with just a high level of a couple of them, but I want to go deeply into one in particular. So, really, you're going to see examples across the board now, and this isn't true in every state, but I think in many states where there's been concerted effort between state and tribal leaders to build, constructive and respectful relationships, you're going to see a variety of examples, across the board from, and all the issues that we've talked about. So whether it's healthcare and things on public health, cooperative law enforcement is another area that you see a lot of agreements. In education, there's quite a bit that's happening here in New Mexico. Cultural preservation, we see more states getting involved in supporting native language maintenance and revitalization efforts. So, those are several examples. But one that's really important to me, before I became a tribal leader, most of the beginning of my career was in what would now be considered the land back movement. And I came back home after college. I was asked by my tribal council to help with the restoration of traditional lands that remained or continue to be important to us, but that were not formally recognized as being owned or held in trust for us. And it was an arduous process. I did this work for about 8.5 years. And we were very fortunate in 2000 to get back the headwaters to our creek, which involved raising a considerable amount of money from philanthropy. So, definitely want to recognize Native Americans and philanthropy for all the work that the organization has done and that Eustaquio's talked about, in particular, building these kind of relationships. That was crucial. Having philanthropy and having state government and federal government support this, really made something historic possible. So along those lines, something that's really, really exciting to me is what's happening in California now. There was a story that broke, I think might have been just last week or a couple of weeks ago, about the return of some land to the Shasta Indian Nation. And Governor Gavin Newsom put out a statement about the state's support for this. And I actually want to read a quote from him. The quote that was attributed to him said, "This work is a down payment on the state's commitment to do better by the Native American communities who have called this land home since time immemorial. By listening to and working with tribes across the state, including to return ancestral homelands and to restore the environment, we are healing deep wounds and rebuilding trust between our people." And this isn't just a statement. What's been encouraging to me about California is that California has created a Truth and Healing Council as part of their goal to conserve 30% of lands in coastal waters by 2030. They've built in strengthening tribal partnerships as a way to accomplish that goal. They've created something called the Tribal Nature-Based Solutions Grant Program, which provides resources for the restoration of land to tribes, including the restoration of title, along with supporting different efforts for co-management, which has been a very big push of the Biden administration and Secretary Holland. So, this is a game changer, I think, and it's something that all states should be paying close attention to and hopefully following. Because, you might think, some folks might think in state government, well, the taking of tribal lands, that's not really our business. That's the federal government's business. We had nothing to do with that. Well, I'd encourage you to check land ownership status in your state. I guarantee you every state owns land, and that land originally belonged to one or more tribal nations. And any revenue that's been generated from any of those lands over time presents a pretty interesting lesson for us, which is, if you look at the land-grant universities, for example, or land-grant institutions, the kinds of funds that have been generated, if you look at the economic value, are staggering. They are staggering. The state benefits from lands that were taken from Native people. And therefore, I think it has a proactive responsibility to enter into agreements, to provide resources, and to support the restoration of land to tribes. So I think that's a fantastic example. You also asked about sort of principles, what makes that possible? I think that really talks to an authentic and respectful relationship that begins at the senior most levels, the governor of the state, to each of the respective tribal leaders, to their various agencies and staff, that really speaks to working together over time, to really understanding thoroughly priorities, and then to building programming and policy and resources to accomplish that together.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to pass this question to Eustaquio as well. Examples of innovative and effective partnerships or policies between states and tribes, and what are the elements of those partnerships that allow them to flourish?
Thank you, Brittany. So I think from the very jump, it's important to acknowledge the smashing success that America the Beautiful has been in demonstrating really what can happen when you get Native voices involved. And, for those who don't know, America the Beautiful, very successful program that really illustrated what opportunities for partnership can be available when we connect. It started with just a simple 10% set aside for tribal involvement by working with NAP, by removing the match requirement. And so having Philanthropy being involved to cover that, we were able to raise the number of Native participants at the end of the day that were awarded grants to 40%. More than 40% of the money went there. So it demonstrated that there is an opportunity here, and that this work can be done in the right way. So America the Beautiful Challenge has been a success that we continue to tout at the federal level between agencies in order to encourage more to really go out and seek Native participation and to demonstrate how it can be done. I spoke earlier about broadband and how it is important that we are, for all of our safety, working across cultural and county and state jurisdictions. There's similar opportunities in energy across the energy sector to really turn our communities to become energy independent. And it often makes the most sense for some of that in rural communities. So there's tremendous opportunity there. But I think, the place where I think the future of the work I can see really happening, it's about for state legislatures, I think it's important for you to know this is about continuity, because you're elected to represent us, all of the communities that are in your elected area, right? And so like it's incumbent upon you to bring resources that can benefit all of that area, not just that. And so if you look at places where state legislatures can partner and have the biggest impact, another area to look at is the Land Water Conservation Fund. Right now they require states to tribes can only apply through state partnership. And so it's an important area where, there's funding available every year for opportunities to partner there. But the new area where I think people should be looking at is on climate-driven relocation. We're seeing it more and more every year. Communities that have to build and rebuild after fire that comes in and scorches them down. At some point, they're going to have to ask themselves, do we continue to rebuild here, or where do we move? And Native communities have been at the edge of that. We have been battling some of this climate-driven work for a while now. And so there's an opportunity to apply all these things that we talk about in conservation spaces and in philanthropy and in planning, and to really to apply all of that work into redesigning what new communities can look like after they have been relocated because of climate change. And there are some communities, Native communities in the United States, in the lower 48 and some in Alaska, that have already been funded, provided some resources to start funding their moving. And it's a hard thing to move an entire community. It's very expensive. There's so much planning that goes into it, and there isn't enough funding available right now to accomplish all the moving that needs to be done. But I think that if we collaborate together in this space, if state, federal government, philanthropy, and some of the best thinkers of our time come together, we can really figure out how to do this in a more cost-effective manner, because it's going to keep happening. We keep seeing a growing need for relocation because of either fires or drought or other climate-related issues. And so I think there's an opportunity for us to grow in this space and to really figure out a way to incorporate and to really come together and do more of this work collaboratively.
Thank you so much. And Quinn, same question for you. Any examples of innovative, effective partnerships, and what are the elements of those partnerships that make them flourish?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I was working for the Chickasaw Nation, I actually had such a shift in my own perspective. I went to work for them right after the McGirt decision, so I was expecting there to be a lot of tension out there, and there of course was. But I remember I was out driving with my boss. I think it was called Love Lady Road. Uh, but he explained to me how the Chickasaw Nation pays for crucial infrastructure in rural Oklahoma. And in fact, that their philosophy is, if state government and local government cannot pay for necessary infrastructure, that the Chickasaw Nation will come in and pay for that infrastructure for the whole community. And how tribal communities are in Oklahoma is different from other places of the US. We have what's called a checkerboard reservation. So there are many tribal citizens and non-tribal citizens who are living all throughout Chickasaw territory. Another example is during COVID, the Chickasaw Nation distributed tens of thousands of COVID vaccines to tribal citizens and non-tribal citizens alike. In an area where there would most likely be a deficit in, there wouldn't be resources available to provide that, perhaps otherwise, or at least there would be a tremendous more strain on state and local government. And then another really important program that I'm so proud to talk about is we have these citizen science programs that we have for children and for older children as well, but getting them out on the land and teaching them how to take samples. And maybe the cement factory is leaking stuff into the water. How else would we know that if there aren't people out here? One thing our environmental services director told me is that the EPA does not fund uh, uh, pollution detection devices in areas that are considered to not have enough of a population. And unfortunately, in Oklahoma, this correlates a lot with areas that have a lot of tribal citizens. So actually, the services that tribal nations are providing are so crucial, not only for lands that tribal citizens live on, but also what non-tribal citizens live on. And then you mentioned what makes these relationships function so well, and I guess, perhaps obviously, is trust. But trust cannot be taken for granted, because it needs to be, better established, I think, in a lot of areas, even though it's working really well in some areas. And I take issue sometimes with the word empower, because to me, empower implies that an entity is, maintaining an unequal power dynamic and just doling out as much power as it needs to give in order to satisfy certain requirements. But in my opinion, true collaboration requires that sharing of power too, that sharing of power and resources, tackling these problems together, and creating solutions that mutually benefit all of us. So
I'm so glad you said that. It's a really great segue into our next question. And that's, what would it look like to promote consent? Moving from, and I think Alvin shared this a little bit early, moving from consultation to collaboration between states and tribes when it comes to environmental decision making. What would that look like? And I'm going to go back to you, Alvin, just to, again, share a little bit more about what that could look like, or what it looks like.
So I want to encourage us to think about, again, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. As again, I think it sets kind of a high bar to which we should aspire. And what you'll find when you read that is really the emphasis on free, prior, and informed consent, which I think is the reason for this question, Brittany. And I think moving towards that in our laws and in our policies and in our practices is what we should be working towards, what we should be aspiring towards. And I'll say for New Mexico, we're on the journey there, I would say. We are not there yet. But one of the things that I think was a positive step in that journey in the State Tribal Collaboration Act was actually calling out, there's a specific provision in the law that says, I'll read it, that it requires state agencies to collaborate with Indian nations, tribes, or pueblos in the development and implementation of policies, agreements, and programs of that state agency that directly affect American Indians and Alaska Natives. So to collaborate with tribes in the development and implementation of policies, agreements, and programs. And it was deliberate, because tribal leaders actually helped to draft the legislative language that became statute. They wanted the language to be collaborate. They didn't want the language to be merely to consult, because we've seen that consultation, when misused, can be used simply as sort of a check the box exercise, or a one-way kind of communication where tribal leaders or tribal representatives communicate, this is what we want, or these are our concerns, and the agency says, great, thanks for telling us, and just continues with what it was planning to do. Collaboration has actually a real meaning. And so the law required each agency to implement or to develop a policy for consultation, collaboration, and communication. And you could look these up on the New Mexico agency websites, but they have very clear language in there that I think begins to get us towards consent. For example, it sets consensus as the goal of these interactions. And it defines consensus as when a decision or outcome is mutually satisfactory to the agency and the tribes affected and adequately address the concerns of those affected. That's really important. It raises the bar, and it says, okay, if a state agency is going to be interacting with a tribe on an issue of mutual concern, they should be aspiring to reach a solution that is mutually acceptable and addresses both of their sets of concerns. The way the state has operationalized this, and I was part of it, some of it during my time, some of it's happening now, is you actually can create state tribal working groups and bring state and tribal leaders and experts together to actually work through the entire issue and then come up with the solution, whether it's a policy or a law or whatever it might be, which is really very different than what has been the norm, where a state agency comes up with something that they think is the right approach, and they sort of more towards the end of the process do a perfunctory sort of check-in with tribes and say, hey, what do you think of this? And the tribes say, we really think this is a bad idea. And they say, gosh, that's terrible. Wish we had known this earlier. We'll try to catch you on the next round. That's what we're trying to get away from. And I think these kinds of things, like emphasizing consensus, setting the bar at collaboration, putting in place practices that actually lead to that, doing the necessary planning, because I think to make this possible depends first and foremost on building relationships, authentic, respectful relationships. It's not just about, I'm going to shoot out an email 2 weeks before and maybe they reply, maybe they don't. It really gets at ongoing, mutually respectful relationships at all levels of agencies and tribes, that then when something is coming up, there's a potential decision that needs to be made or a policy, there's early communication about it, folks sit down and talk through it at really the problem identification stage, way before the solution is developed, so that everybody has a shared understanding of the problem to be solved or the opportunity to be taken advantage of, and then mutually crafts what becomes the solution. And I think doing this in a way where not just the tribal representatives are responsible for saying, here are the rights and the responsibilities, but having educated state counterparts that also know this, that have taken the responsibility to learn for themselves. So it's not all just on the tribal representatives. When I've seen this done well, that all these elements are present. And I think it goes back to something Eustaquio said. We sometimes can forget how effective partners tribes can be. Tribal governments have really come to this point across the board of building incredible expertise and knowledge, usually doing a lot with sometimes limited resources, so have learned to become very efficient, and can be really good partners in developing solutions if engaged authentically, that usually leads to a better outcome than what would have otherwise have happened.
Thank you so much. That's a lot in there. And before I go to Eustaquio and Quinn with the same question, just wanted to put it out to our live audience. We are accepting questions. If you have any, we will be pulling in some questions from our audience next. But Eustaquio, what would it look like to promote consent between states, tribes when it comes to environmental decision making?
Thank you. I appreciate everything that Alvin has spoken, and really, I think he gave the definitions for what that could look like. And it really speaks to the other point that was made about, that's how you develop trust. And so it's this urgency for, for consent and transparency. But I guess if I were to frame it in a way that I think state legislators can understand, it's, earlier Alvin spoke about this phrase, time immemorial. And how Native communities have been in these spaces since time immemorial. And so that means that before we understood that there was time, before we understood the concept of time, our people were already there, and they're still there. And so the connection that Native leaders and Native communities have to the land goes beyond your elected term limits. So they are going to be here longer than you are going to be here, and then the impact of your work is going to be here. And so without that consent from the representatives, those leaders that are there speaking for that land, and in our Native cultures, it's a relationship. So it's a communication, it's a conversation that goes both ways. So they are in the best position to inform you what the next steps that the land wants you to take. And so without incorporating and working that into your solution, it is not likely that it will succeed or perform to the best that it can. And what a difference it makes when you do get it, because then that work outlives, your expectations, and then also, the impact that you thought it might have.
Thank you so much. And Quinn, same question. What would it look like to promote consent?
Yeah, I just like to echo everything that Alvin and Eustaquio have already said. And I don't know if I could add much more on the legal front, but just to iterate how foreign of a concept this is, unfortunately, in a lot of spaces. So in some of the documentary work that I've done, it's been an uphill battle to convince some clients that they need to reach out to tribal nations if they're going to be producing documentary work about them. It's an idea of the documentarian, as the author, like this author who has ultimate control over, stories, versus, ensuring that a community that has been for centuries excluded from telling their story on their own terms has that right, to tell the story in the most accurate way too. And that's, another struggle too in my work, that if you give tribal nations control over self-determination, that they're going to use that to create an exploitative power dynamic, and that couldn't be further from the truth. We're not asking for that. We're asking to be put on the same uh, level, the same playing field. And I wish that was better understood. But I can speak to when I've gone out and forged these relationships with uh, different representatives from tribal nations. These relationships have extended far beyond this work, just because people are so moved, that you would unfortunately respect the bare minimum, I think, of what people should be getting, which is the ability to self-determine, and self-determination is impossible without consent.
Thank you so much. So we're going to go to a question from our audience. This question comes from Mariah Humphreys, and if I pronounced that wrong, please forgive me. But any ideas on how non-native justice orgs can best partner with tribes? And let's see, Quinn, I think I'm going to come to you with that first. Any ideas that you have on how non-native justice orgs can best partner with tribes?
Well, I think that reaching out and forging that relationship, tribes are staffed with people to manage these types of relationships. And reaching out directly to tribes has always worked for me. Of course, tribes are, have a lot to deal with. So, as was said earlier, making sure that respectful, not sending an email 2 weeks before it's major decision, but just reaching out to tribal nations. It's surprising how many people just don't even engage in that first step.
Absolutely right. Estaquio, do you have any thoughts on how non-native led justice orgs can partner with tribes?
Well, I think it's important to take a look at any kind of work that the tribe is engaging in right now, and to see if there's areas of alignment, especially any public work where you could come in and lend the support of your organization to the cause, especially if it's justice organizations. I think that's important. The other thing is showing up, and especially if you're a state legislature and you have tribes and reservations in your area, you should have a relationship with them. But if not, reach out, try to get those appointments scheduled. And if you're having a hard time with that, you can go through the Office of Strategic Partnerships, and we're happy to help. But it's about that relationship that needs to develop. But it's always great to start in a place where we align. And so looking for areas that you can support, a project that a tribe is already involved in, as a way to develop that relationship first before, working on other ideas together. But I think it's an exciting time to be doing this. I think our communities have been asking for this for a long time, and it's a space where you really can't ignore the work that is yet to be done.
Thank you so much. And Alvin, to you too. Any ideas on how non-native justice orgs can best partner with tribes?
Yeah, I think Quinn and Estaquio really got I think most of it. What I might just emphasize a little bit is I think it's pretty important for those organizations that have a justice focus to first sort of check their own assumptions. Because what I've seen in my experience is sometimes organizations have a sense that, the priorities they've identified, or perhaps the strategies and policies or initiatives, they can sometimes make the risk, or run the risk of making an assumption that just sort of doing this particular thing will benefit Native people, will benefit tribes without actually asking, without actually having the conversation to find out, well, does the issue actually play differently within a tribal community? And I think when those conversations happen in an authentic way early enough among organizations that really should be allies in these efforts, powerful things can happen. One of the best examples from New Mexico is the New Mexico Center for Law and Poverty in 2014 filed something that became the Yazzie versus New Mexico education sufficiency lawsuit. And the basics of this is it was a contention that ended up getting found to be correct by tribal advocates, that the state of New Mexico had failed to meet its constitutional requirements to provide a sufficient education to Native American students, as well as to 3 other categories of students. That partnership was the Center for Law and Poverty working with other advocacy organizations and with Native plaintiffs and tribal governments. It was a really powerful alliance that has become transformational in New Mexico, particularly in terms of significantly increased funding. There's still a lot more that needs to be done, but I point to that example because it really came to the Center for Law and Poverty having these discussions, understanding the concerns that Native parents had in particular with the education of their students, and then building a strategy around that rather than saying, well, we're concerned about education, we're going to craft this strategy, and then we're going to just try to get tribal folks on board with what we think is right. There's a kind of a different approach that I think is necessary to really make sure that it is, again, it goes back to kind of the same principle of collaboration, that there is learning, that there's authentic relationships, that there's trust, so that ultimately then when it's time for action, it's really shared and concerted action.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Mariah, for your question. If there are other audience questions, we'd love to bring those into the conversation. And I want to go back to why we're here, talking to state legislators, wanting to give them a bigger, broader understanding of tribal relations. And the question I have really is, what would you say is an entry-level policy option for state legislators that want to better support tribes? And you can think of that in the context of your state, in the context of your work, really thinking about what is the first entry-level policy option for state legislators. And I'm coming to you, Eustaquio, first.
Well, I'm going to lean on something that Alvin said earlier. I think, having a listening session is the first thing, so I would encourage you, especially if there's a break in between, once you called into session, and if you have some of these short runs, and then you have an opportunity to go out and meet in community. I think that's the best way that you'll get a really good sense for where the community is at and the areas of focus where you could work together. So I would schedule a listening session and find out, and then also have an opportunity for you, to share what some of your priorities are, to see if there's any alignment in that. But, nothing beats an in-person meeting with our tribal elders and our community leaders. So I would start there.
Excellent. What about you, Quinn? What do you think is a first entry-level policy option?
Yeah, I would completely agree. I was going to suggest that everybody should go out and create an ethical documentary, that's the ethical piece is kind of hard, but essentially it's going out and listening to indigenous peoples on their own terms, on being invited to share space on these beautiful territories, and listening to what the concerns are, and oftentimes they're very different from even what an informed indigenous expert who's not from that community might think. And I've had that experience so many times. When I did a documentary in our Chickasaw and Choctaw homelands, I had at that point, almost graduated with a degree in public policy, and had worked for the Chickasaw Nation, had worked with so many tribal elders throughout the South and Oklahoma, and across from a whole bunch of corners, but I was just my assumptions were fundamentally challenged, flipped on their heads, and all sorts of things, because it's just so vast. And back in the day, we were managing these, we managed these territories because of that, because, you know, we fostered these relationships with these specific areas. And unfortunately, a lot of that has not been allowed to flourish and continue as it should. But um, it sounds like that's changing in a lot of areas.
Thank you so much. And Alvin, same question. First, entry-level policy option for state legislators that want to support tribes.
So, you know, recognizing that state legislatures, that there's a whole variety in terms of the structures, the staffing, the resources, the amount of time you're in session. So recognizing there's just a wide diversity there. I think, you know, if I was speaking to an individual legislator who asked me this question, I would say, well, pick an issue area that's important to you. And then if you have resources within the legislature to help you do analysis of statute, or you have staff or others who could perhaps help you do an analysis of state statute that relates to that issue, and look for things like, if there's a funding program, are tribes and tribal entities and Native American entities named as eligible recipients? You'd be surprised, or maybe you wouldn't be surprised, how often tribes and Native entities are unintentionally or sometimes intentionally excluded from accessing state funds, more often because somebody didn't think about it. And so, you know, you run the gamut of sort of naming different eligible entities that are public entities, you know, that are legally allowed to receive funding, public funding, and somebody forgot to include, you know, tribes, forgot to include tribal entities. And there's a potential opportunity to sort of fix that. 2 years ago, we sort of did this with regard to career technical education funding. So this is not an environmental issue, but it's a good example where the state of New Mexico provides funding to schools to support learning that leads to a career. Well, when that statute was created, it did not include tribally controlled schools. And so, you know, we have prominent institutions like Navajo Preparatory School. We have the Santa Fe Indian School. By virtue of just missing a little bit of language in that law, those entities serving Native students were excluded, and they are public entities. These are not private schools. They're public entities recognized under New Mexico law, but it was just an inadvertent thing. So if there's an environmental program that is providing funding for land stewardship, land restoration, for educational restoration, for all these things, and a tribe is not named as an entity or as eligible entity or a Native organization, that's something you could fix. That's an entry-level policy fix that could be done. You know, another thing that I think is important to think about is, what are the formal mechanisms? I like the ideas of having, you know, both a documentary to help build knowledge, because I think that's crucial. Having a convening with tribal representatives, that's crucial. But how do you keep that from being a one-off thing? So think about what the example I gave in New Mexico, where there's an interim committee specifically for Indian Affairs. Is there an opportunity to create something like that as part of your state government? And if it's too big of a lift to make it a standalone entity, how can you build that explicitly into the responsibilities of an existing legislative entity, whether it's a committee or whatever kind of body it might be? And how do you then use that mechanism to have regular and ongoing communication that supports all state legislators? Because, you know, it's helpful if you have one legislator who's a real champion who can spend the time, but that's one legislator among many. So how do you build a structure that informs many legislators so that you have the critical mass necessary to enact policy and to really kind of make a difference in the way that my fellow panelists and I have talked about?
Thank you so much. And I'm coming right back to you, because that really leads into this next question I have for you specifically. As you know, coming from New Mexico, state legislations move super fast, and relationship building does not always move that fast. In fact, if you're really getting to trust, if you're really getting to a deep understanding and consensus, that's not necessarily a quick process. How can state legislators address the urgency of needing to center tribes in decision-making while also investing in long-term and healthy relationships that aren't extractive?
Wow. Yeah, that is a conundrum, right? You know, because we can all sit here and say, yes, it's the right thing to do to build these long and enduring relationships. And the nature of government is things come up. Things come up suddenly. I think this is where I think all three of us have all emphasized this idea of building ongoing, respectful, trusting relationships. When those are in place, it actually provides a mechanism to handle the more urgent issues that come up. Because if somebody's reaching out to me as a tribal leader and I've never heard from them, they've never reached out to me, and suddenly they're asking for my help on something, I'm going to have a different response than if it's somebody who I've known for a couple of years, I've worked with, we've had conversations. I believe they understand the issues that are important to my tribe. Then I can sort of meet them halfway with the urgency of what might be coming up in the moment. So I think, in a way, my sort of way of kind of changing the question a little bit, or using part of the question as the answer, is by investing in building these longer term relationships, by the way, that are not centered on one person. I think this is another place where I've seen just really unfortunate things happen, where you have somebody who's really proactive in an agency or in a tribe, and they really want to build these relationships, and that's great, and then they leave, and the relationships leave with them. That's not going to serve anybody. So if you build in these relationships across state and tribal entities and Native organizations, I don't want to leave Native nonprofits organizations, because we have a tremendous number of Native people who don't live on tribal lands. They live in urban areas, and they're served by Native organizations. Yes, there's many of them are served by their tribes as well, but they're served by Native organizations where they live. So having these enduring relationships with tribes and Native organizations is a solution that then can afford itself or make itself available when things come up urgently. And there's a need to, hey, we have a limited time frame to respond to this opportunity or to address this crisis, and that's how we leverage it.
Thank you so much. I just passing that question back to Eustaquio and Quinn, coming to Eustaquio first. Thank you. How can state legislators address the urgency of needing to center tribes in decision-making while investing in long-term successful relationships?
So I think that Alvin just sort of cracked this for us, because it really is, the sense of urgency comes from, anchoring these institutions. So anchoring these institutions that can help the ongoing development of relationships with Indian country, right? So the Office of Strategic Partnerships is one, like Alvin's position is also one. And so I think if there's a sense of urgency, maybe to try to institutionalize those ongoing relationship building, that would be critical, because when things come up, it can also be good things. Good things come up, right? Now there's a pot of money that the federal government is trying to get out for this specific need. And if there's an existing relationship and also an anchored institution that you could run this through, then you're able to move at the speed of opportunity and really draw down those federal resources that ultimately end up benefiting all of the community. So I would say, focusing on those anchor institutions and then continue with that ongoing relationship development. And those would be my recommendations right now.
Awesome. Thank you. And Quinn, same question.
Yeah, just to echo everything that Alvin and Eustaquio said, I feel like I keep saying that. Must be like the order or something, but looking for ways to fund gatherings of people who are working in these sectors, from multiple different sectors. We just did one, Neotero Indigenous Leadership Initiative, Christensen Fund, Resources Legacy Fund, and Lhasa Conservation Fund had a gathering for Indigenous land guardianship in Lummi territory, the invitation of Lummi Nation. And we were just amazed by how much work was going on across Turtle Island that we had no idea about. And also, best practices. Unfortunately, we have so much on our plates throughout our day-to-day that we might not have the opportunity to connect with others, especially if they work in completely different sectors, like, government and philanthropy, or NGO and government. So yeah, looking for ways to sponsor these types of gatherings, I guess is the right word.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I'm coming right back to you with this more aspirational question that when I say healthy and thriving state tribal relationships, what does that look like? What does that sound like? What does that feel like? How do you envision that? So back to Quinn.
Yeah, I guess I would, at risk of saying something I've said again, just a trustful relationship. I guess I would imagine a relationship rooted in a concept of human flourishing or collective well-being, or I don't know, just where the human aspect of the relationship is the most important part. I feel like that work could really pick up if that was the primary assumption or common starting place.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Quinn. And Estakia, healthy and thriving state tribal relationships.
I would define that as having already put the work in so that when things come up, you're able to just pick up the phone and schedule a meeting and directly with the either tribal leadership or vice versa, right? That the tribe is also able to pick up the phone and schedule a meeting with their state elected official.
Wonderful. And Alvin, same question.
I'm going to give four words: informed, engaged, impactful, and systemic. So informed, ideally folks are coming to the table with a shared understanding about not just their own needs and concerns and issues, and I'm talking both on the tribal and the state side, but of each other's issues, where there's an appreciation of each other's goals, each other's priorities, and in the case of tribes, a full understanding of treaties, a full understanding of tribal sovereignty, an understanding of history and the connection to land. And what Estacio pointed out, the data that shows so clearly, especially in environmental areas, how Native people are leaders, global leaders in the conservation and the protection of land. So informed. I think engaged is everything we've talked about, those ongoing relationships, that trust building, that it's not just a one-off thing or a sudden email or a sudden phone call. This is part of an enduring relationship that folks on both sides are investing in. Impactful is important because it actually, I think, having the healthy relationships also means getting things done. What I think can sometimes be a challenge is when you have a lot of good conversations and you understand each other, but it doesn't actually translate into action. That's not good for the state. It's not good for the tribes either. But when those conversations then lead to a policy solution, to a statute, to some kind of change, to an appropriation or whatever action is appropriate, that actually then has a benefit back to the shared citizenry that we're talking about. Tribal members. As a tribal member, I'm a citizen of my tribe. I'm a citizen of the state of New Mexico. I'm a citizen of the United States. So, that shared citizenry in states that tribes and states, I think, both have responsibility to. And the last thing is systemic. We've talked about different ways to build the structures so that these interactions are enduring. They don't just depend on one individual who happens to take an interest in this, that they can be enduring because they're built into the systems and structures on both the tribal and the state side.
Thank you so much. I really want to thank you for sharing and for really providing a lot of key points. Even if those points are reiterated, I think they're reiterated for a purpose, is that they are just so important and need to be really remembered. They say that you need to say things to folks at least 3 times before they hear it. So really appreciate you guys sharing, and we're coming to our last question, and I want to just leave the floor with you. The audience for this is state legislators, and if they could walk away with one piece of knowledge, what would you want that takeaway to be? And I will start with Estakia.
Thanks, Brittany. really hard to just focus on one, but hopefully if you're here, you're already here because you know the importance of relationship building and why, our tribal relatives and our tribal communities that are in your elected space deserve to be heard as well. But if I could leave you just one piece of knowledge, just take a look at the Access to Capital Clearinghouse at the Department of Interior's website. You just go to doi.bia.gov/ATC. If you look at that website, and it does get updated regularly with new opportunities for federal funding for our tribal communities, you can scroll there and look at the amount of resources that are on the table ready to be distributed to tribes. And those tribes oftentimes are looking for a partnership to help get them access to that table. And so I think it's incumbent upon our state legislatures to understand how to leverage those state dollars towards bigger federal dollars, and then how to be really good partners in this space. So I would say, if I could leave you with one thing, is it's never been a better time to partner with Indian country, and take a look at the Access to Capital Clearinghouse for some inspirational ideas on where to get started.
Thank you so much. Quinn, same question. What do you want state legislators to walk away with? What's the one piece of knowledge that you say would be that key takeaway?
Yeah, I guess I would kind of say something maybe on the flip side of that, which is a lot of this work has been going on successfully for quite some time, like at the Chickasaw Nation. So if you see an opportunity to forge a relationship like this, you better before you get left behind.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Alvin, last words.
Well, thank you, Brittany. You've done a great job facilitating this. Appreciate all the good questions. Stakio, it's always good to see you. Quinn, great to meet you and to hear about the work you're doing. And thanks to everybody who's joined. I think if I'm thinking particularly of legislators who have joined, and I would assume we're also talking maybe to a few Native legislators, it's something that I think for a lot of us as Indigenous people, it's kind of an exciting time. Every single cycle, we see more Native people elected to various legislatures or county commissions or school boards. It's long overdue. Not to mention to see our first Native cabinet secretary in Secretary Holland. I would say to legislators, you can and should make a difference. Like sometimes, especially we learn more about the history of these things, it can be really daunting. It can feel kind of impossible. And we can sometimes think like, how can I as one individual make a change into this? Like, it's almost overwhelming. It's too much. And I want to sort of say, yeah, you actually can make a big difference. And it can start with you. And, if your state legislature is really at the beginning of building these relationships, using your elected position to raise these issues, to make them visible, to create pathways for tribes, it's invaluable. To be a person who can be a point of access. Even you as an individual, making yourself available to tribal folks as a way to better understand the legislative process. You can't imagine how important that is just in and of itself. But I think it's just important to think about this as you can make a difference. Wherever you are, maybe your state is far down the road and you've done many things that kind of are along the lines of the principles we've talked about. I'm sure there are ways to improve. And where can you be innovative? Where can you help your state to increase and to improve? It really, I think, as one legislator, you actually can make a big difference.
Thank you all again for sharing your time, your knowledge. It's just been a pleasure to hear and talk with all of you. And I'm very excited that we are able to provide this opportunity for our various audiences, and especially for state legislators who have such a real impact on our day-to-day lives. I'd like to bring back to the studio Kate. Just so happy to have you in this partnership, and we're very excited to continue providing these educational resources for our communities. So, well, thank you, Kate.
Thanks, Brittany. And thanks to the panelists. Y'all got me Googling how to run for office, Massachusetts. So you've definitely inspired a lot of people, really brilliant remarks. In fact, we already have proof because as we've been on this panel, I got an email from a legislator who was tuning in saying, I'd like to do something about this. Can we chat? So I'll be shooting an email to you all soon to follow up on that. And I just want to close by kind of summarizing some of the key points that I've heard, and also just to flag again that this year across 44 states, 78% of seats are up. So this is a huge tipping point for this next long legislative session, and there are lots of opportunities that our panelists laid out to really make a difference. And some of those I'm hearing are structural improvements, making sure there's a Native voice at the cabinet level, institutionalizing these relationships to build into interim committees, offices of strategic partnership, or other high-level positions where Native voices are key and centered. I'm also hearing some low-hanging fruit around land and water conservation funding and climate-driven relocation and eligibility to access state and federal fundings. And some of the kind of key themes I'm hearing are that there's nothing more American than Native American, as Estaquio put it, and it makes good business sense for states to be partnering with tribes. And that these issues that are important to states and tribes really can't be fully addressed by either alone, as Alvin put it. And that states really can and should operate under, as Quinn put it, this philosophy that is rooted in care. And so I just think I learned a ton from this. I'm inspired. I think there are a lot of state legislators that could do really great work in partnership with tribes to advance the prosperity, health, and safety of all of their constituents, tribal and non-Native alike. I'm also going to invite y'all to fill out a survey that's getting put in the chat. Let us know what you thought of this. Do you want us to do something like this again? Are you interested in working together? Let us know. We're happy to set up some time to understand some of your priorities and figure out how we can turn ideas into action. And then if you are a legislator, we invite you to join us in Louisville in August at our national forum. If you're interested in kind of talking with other peers around topics related to this, come join us in person, and we'll put some information in the follow-up email for that as well. But otherwise, huge thanks to everybody that joined and for the knowledge and insights and lived experiences of all of our panelists. We really appreciate everything you've done and continue to do to make this world better. So thank you all.